Welcome to the Superstar Communicator podcast. My name is Susan Heaton-Wright, a leading impact, speaking and communications expert. My aim is to show you how to make an impact so you will be heard, listened to and respected for career success. Listen weekly to the podcast and go to our website, superstarcommunicator.com. Hi everybody, this is Susan Heaton-Wright from Superstar Communicator. Thank you very much for tuning in today. I'm always so grateful that I've got listeners and people who engage with me. Now, before I start the podcast, I'd like to give a little shout out, first of all, to Elisabetta and Stefan. It was lovely to meet you again, and also thank you very much for inviting me to go and speak at the Marie Curie Alumni Association, a huge honour, and I know from the feedback that you found it really, really useful. Thank you so much. And also another shout out for John Baker. And I know that you listen to the podcast because you've told me so, and you very, very kindly invited me to be on your podcast, and I will obviously be sharing that podcast around the community so that people can listen to it. John's podcast is about being introverted. Believe it or not, I am an introvert. I was at a very good friend's book launch last week, and she's written a book about introverted women, and I was on the panel for it, a discussion panel, and nobody believed that I was an introvert. There you go. We can play at being extrovert. But let's move on, because this podcast is not about that. This podcast is about the 6th anniversary, or the 6th birthday of the Superstar Communicator podcast. Yay! It's 6 years since I took that big step, recorded my first podcast, and I literally read all of the words from a script to now. Yes, I still plan, I still have my notes, but it's more conversational now because I've got more confident. I had this vision that I really, really wanted to have a podcast literally about the spoken word, how we communicate by speaking to each other and having conversations, whether they are one-to-one, whether they're online and not hiding behind text messages, actually using your human voice, whether it's in meetings, whether it's pitching, presentations, all of those aspects of spoken communication, but the non-verbal communication that goes with that. I think that John actually picked up one crucial theme that comes out of it, and that is impact, making sure that what you say makes an impact rather than being noise, because there's so much noise out there, and I know that you, the listeners, want to make sure that whenever you speak, that you do make a positive impact and people actually listen and engage to you. But that was really my vision, and I've really kept to it with the Superstar Communicator podcast, because I didn't want to go into perhaps something like women speaking, or it being something about female conversations, because I wanted it to be broader than that with respect to women, of which I'm one. But more recently I have spoken a little bit more about virtual speaking, because more and more we are being driven by the internet and the virtual world, and we can still do that. I'm doing a podcast. That is a technology that's in the virtual world, and also vlogs and videos and things like that. I will probably bring in somebody in a few weeks' time to do a podcast about this, because there are some techniques that we can use that can still engage the audience. One of the things that I found before I was starting to podcast was that little voice that goes ahead in your mind. Um, in my case, it was, will I get any listeners? Will I be relevant? Is it just a little bit vain and self-indulgent to have a podcast? Is a bit me? And for a number of months, I procrastinated. Now, I am delighted to say that 6 years after I set up my podcast, it is far easier to upload podcasts and to get them on different platforms. When I started 6 years ago, it was actually a much more complicated process, but I managed it. And I am so glad that I didn't listen to that little voice. And one thing that I would say, and I don't know if you find this, when you've got that little voice going, making lots of noise in your head, trying to stop you from doing something new, that little voice is trying to protect you from danger. And if you don't listen to that, but are aware of the noise, you realise that actually it could be pushing you outside your natural comfort zone, and so you can grow. And that was certainly the case with me. I did step outside my comfort zone and started the podcast. And guess what? I'm still here 6 years later. I've had thousands of downloads from all over the world, and I regularly get feedback from people, and that has built my confidence. I've also been invited to be a guest on numerous podcasts, which is a huge honour whenever I go on somebody else's podcast. And inevitably they say, oh, you know the deal, it's just natural for you because you have your own podcast. But also, and this is something that I'm going to blow my trumpet now, but something that I'm really proud of, and that is the number of times that people say, do you know, you're a really good listener and you are a really good person to host the podcast, because you know what questions to ask, you know when to be quiet, because actually when you're a guest you want to be able to share your expertise without somebody butting in and telling you how good they are all the way through. I've had some laughs over that time. As I said, I've had quite a few guests from all over the world, and in some cases I've actually connected and invited people via LinkedIn who have written incredible books that I thought that you, the audience, would find value. There have been some absolutely fantastic podcasts, and I would recommend that you go through the list and listen to some back numbers, because some of the interviews are absolutely incredible. We've had one or two laughs. I have to admit that there are two people that I did not use their interviews because they were spent the entire time just pitching their own services. It was quite remarkable, and I know that you, the listener, would not be interested in that because that's not what this podcast is about. We also had one interview last year which was hilarious, and people still keep getting back to me about this. It was one about difficult conversations, and I could not get a word in edgeway. This particular individual was not listening to me. I would have thought conversations were two-way and you have to listen as well as talk. But clearly this was not the case, even though she felt she was an expert on difficult conversations. But we shall move on and enjoy that moment. So, 6 years later, and I'm still here. The message I want to say to you as an introvert, as someone that, does get nervous about doing new things, go for it. Try and think about what outcomes you could have from this, what benefits you can have from this. In my case, I didn't have a plan about what the benefits would be, but the benefits for me have been immense. I have loyal listeners who listen every time, and I'm hugely grateful for all of your feedback. I've also been able to reach out to a number of new people, get information from their perspective, have proper conversations that I have valued, and I'm sure that you, the listeners, have value too. But also, guess what? I've got business from this. Not millions of pounds, but I've got business because I am able to demonstrate what I'm good at, and people have shared my material to other people. That's superb, isn't it? So if you are thinking about doing a podcast, or thinking about doing a vlog, or thinking about stepping up and speaking, go for it. Listen to that little voice, because that little voice is trying to protect you, but realise that that little voice is trying to stop you from stepping outside of your comfort zone. So try it. Put that toe out into the unknown and go for it. And listeners, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, this is Susan Heaton-Wright from Superstar Communicator. You have been listening to the Superstar Communicator podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and review the podcast on iTunes and on apps. Please contact us if you want to discuss any topic, could suggest a topic for us to include, or a guest who could come onto the podcast. Go to superstarcommunicator.com.